Hello, this is James Rees. Welcome back to Razorwire. I'd like today to carry on with our PCI DSS program of videos. So we've covered a number of different things related to PCI. We've gone through some of the basics. We've gone through the need for scoping and the emphasis on scoping. We've gone through some of the myths and so on and so forth. And now it's time to start looking objectively at the requirements themselves. And where to begin. Now, this may be a bit of a controversial video if you're a QSA. Some QSAs do things slightly differently. There's a prioritized approach that's been developed and utilized a number of times, which you can find on the Security Council's website. It's pretty good as a general rule. I've used it a number of times with organizations. I know a lot of organizations have used it in order to figure out what to start with, that kind of thing. But from my own perspective, one of the things that I like to try to hit very early on when dealing with PCI DSS as a project with people is to look at requirement 12 pretty early on. Now, why requirement 12? Okay, there's 12 sets of requirements within PCI. And it's very easy when you first look at PCI, if you've never seen it before, and start looking through the requirements, to think that it's basically an IT project. It was something that we covered in the myths, and I did kind of cover one of those. But just to re-emphasize that when you look at requirement 1, it talks all about firewalling and that kind of thing, and firewall rule sets and so on and so forth. PCI is not a IT project. There's a lot of IT elements in there. Okay. I tend to like to prefer to start with the requirement 12, which is right at the end of the requirements before you go into the appendix or the appendices. Why do I start with requirement 12? Well, requirement 12 is all about information security governance. And to be totally honest, it's going to be such a big strategic aspect of what you're doing in a PCI project to get the governance right. And when you look through requirement 12, there's a lot in there about information security policies, making sure they're being reviewed, making sure that you're looking at your third parties, making sure they're being reviewed on a regular basis, making sure you're aware of maybe third parties, service providers who are providing you services where they're needing to provide you with attestations of compliance for themselves for the services that they provide to you, and having programs to maintain your information security governance in a manner that's appropriate for the business. There's a lot in requirement 12. There's incident responses, all kinds of things. I'm not going to go through each and every single requirement in depth. But needless to say, I think a good first port of call is to just sit and look through requirement 12. Because in many respects, if you're not doing a large chunk of requirement 12, then there's going to be a number of other areas in all the other requirements that you're also not going to be facilitating. As I've said in previous videos, when you're looking through most of the requirements before you get to 12 at least, they tend to follow a similar fashion. Now, I've already urged you to do this, but if you haven't already done it, download the PDF version of a report on compliance, or a ROC, from the PCI DSS Security Council's website. Why do that? Well, when you look through the requirements, it will actually tell you what the testing median is for each of those requirements. How does the QSA verify that something is in place, not in place, or whatever? You will actually see on each of the requirements, normally a requirement for something to be written down, a requirement for somebody to be interviewed to validate what you've read, and then some form of evidence to prove that what you've been told and what you've read is actually in place. Sometimes that's reviewing a sample set of machines for certain configurations. Sometimes it's looking through sort of log files. There's a whole plethora of different ways to be able to prove a requirement is in place. And that's something maybe I'll cover on a different video. But as a general rule, what I try to do is, by hitting requirement 12 early, and facilitating the information security policies, the procedures, and getting all of requirement 12 right, or at least well on the way to being in place on the whole, you're going to be probably dealing with a number of other of those documentational requirements throughout the remainder of the standard. Now, there are going to be requirements where you're going to have to produce kind of more technical based documentation and what have you, and that's catered for in the individual requirements. But objectively, if you're not doing requirement 12 right, there's going to be a whole plethora of things in a lot of the other requirements that won't be able to be put down as in place. So hit requirement 12 first. 12 is all about your basic information security governance, who's responsible for it, what your policies and procedures state. It's all built around ensuring you have a security function within the organization who is, responsible for the management of InfoSec. A lot of people who are outside of information security kind of get the impression, usually in their early days before we start talking to them, that security is very much an IT thing. And that's something I mentioned at the beginning of this video. It really isn't. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into it. Adequate background checks for staff, security awareness training, the policies, the procedures, the ongoing review of those policies and procedures to make sure that they're current and up to date and they cover the items required in order to maintain a standard level of security baseline. Your vendor products and solutions layer on top of that. So when you're going through PCI, do yourself a favor, sit down, look at requirement 12, look at it objectively. Okay. Look at what it's requiring you to do. Okay. If you don't have any information security people in your organization, it's likely you're going to need to procure the services of one, or maybe the services of an organization who can provide you some kind of CISO as a service, who can help you manage that as well. Once you have that function in place, then build your policies and procedures based around the culture and the needs of the organization. You can go out and download policies and, procedures from the internet. Maybe, if you've not done it before, it's a good way of looking at what other people have done and good reference material to read through so you can understand how good policies and procedures are written and managed and maintained. But every organization is very different. One of the things I like to say to people is an organization is like an organism. It has multiple different aspects of it that need to work together in order for the organization to run efficiently and effectively, to do what it does. You have the brains of the organization, you have the heart of the organization, you have, different departments, you have different systems and services that make up the whole. Information security is much like an immune system. We have to know and understand an organization and a business in order to protect it, either from itself or from external threats and issues. Once we understand how that organization works, we can really kind of build out that information security to be efficient and effective in that particular organization. What you do for one organization doesn't always necessarily work for another organization. As I said, everybody is different, and then you have the cultural aspect as well that you need to consider. There's no good putting in security countermeasures that the staff aren't going to take on board and that they're not going to follow. It's completely useless at that point. So you need to be very careful on how you build your governance piece and how you manage that governance piece with employees, members of staff, and the organization at large. And that is what requirement 12 is in essence asking you to do. One of the things I like to talk about is the intent. When you're going through compliance and you're reading the requirements, don't just look at what specifically it says. Okay. Try to get a view and understand what the intent behind it is. Okay. So if the requirement is have an information security policy, PCI is not a box ticking exercise unless you're in the self-assessment side of things, in which case it can be a little bit like that. When I go in to look at organizations and to sign off on requirement 12, and one of the first ones in there is I have an information security policy. You can show me a information security policy that you downloaded, where you've just renamed whatever company you downloaded it from, usually a university, who tend to publish a lot of theirs. But if you haven't gone through it and you haven't taken the bits that work for you and reconditioned that policy to work for your organization, it's going to become very apparent very quickly that, you've just downloaded a policy set and you haven't properly read it through. Not because some of the language might be a bit odd or they might have forgotten to remove some of the names of where it originally came from, but the security policy isn't going to support the business culture and be that first part of that immune system for that organization. So, whilst you can use downloadable policies and procedures, there's a number of different sources for that. Don't rely on them. And remember, information security is an important business function. The first rule of business, protect your investment. Etiquette of a banker. Look up that particular quote. It's one I use quite a bit. But try to understand the intent behind the requirement that's there. If the requirement is saying you must perform at least annually reviews for your key service providers to ensure that they're PCI compliant, then do it. Have a program to do that. To be honest, in this day and age, you should be reviewing key service providers for security reasons on a regular basis. Anyway, even outside of PCI, it's highly recommended to do that. We're living in a business world now where there's a lot of, especially, nowadays, there's a lot of cloud services. There's a lot of services that are being offered up by other organizations external to you as an organization. So, it's understandable to be able to turn around to them and say, how secure are you? What is your security countermeasures? Are you compliant with PCI DSS? Obviously, because that's part of the standard and you have to do that. The intent behind it is to make sure that your supply chain is at least as secure as you are, or at least as secure as the standard requires, because obviously you need to get that AOC. And the intent behind it is to make sure that there are no weak links in that chain. Okay. There've been plenty of situations before, if you look through historical breaches, where it wasn't the firm itself that was at fault and had the breach. It was, in actual fact, a service provider or somebody providing a service to that organization who incurred the breach, and the knock-on effect was a breach for the actual organization procuring the services. So, good tip, always make sure you have a right to audit in your contracts with your service providers, okay? And ask them the questions. A lot of people will kind of send over questionnaires, that kind of thing. That is useful to understand a little bit more about the security your third party is providing. But it's always a good idea to have a conversation with their InfoSec professionals. Get your InfoSec professional to have a conversation with their InfoSec professional. A simple conversation can go a really, really long way to understanding a little bit more about the security of that service provider and what they're doing to protect services they're providing you, and maybe data that they're holding and are the custodians of on your behalf, as you as the data owner. So when you look through requirement 12, you see a lot of that. Look at those intents. Make sure you have a governance perspective of what you're doing. Make sure you have a charter, security policies, supporting procedures, that you review them and you test various different procedures over the course of the year. Once you get requirement 12 lit and done, the rest of the requirement becomes a bit easier. Okay, there's still some gotchas in there, but if you look at one of the first requirements in requirement 6, it's having a vulnerability management program where you can understand the vulnerabilities and rank those vulnerabilities based on criticality. I'm not sure why it's in 6. I kind of know why it's in 6. Obviously, I've been a QSA for a long time. But it's kind of reflected in requirement 11, and then it's reflected again in requirement 12, where you have to understand your risk profiling of your business. So by getting requirement 12 done, getting it done early, the rest of the requirements become a little bit easier because a lot of the documentational pieces have pretty much already been done. Okay, you're still going to have to produce server documentation, network documentation, and all the rest of it, which is in other requirements, which isn't part of requirement 12. but there's going to be references back to, say, the risk management or the vulnerability management programs that you follow. So hit that early, okay? I'll be covering the requirements over the course of these videos. If at any point you have any questions about anything that I've covered, or you want me to do a deeper dive into a specific requirement or set of requirements that you're finding complicated or difficult to achieve, then drop a comment in the section. If you don't want to make a comment, I can understand you probably might not if you're looking for advice. Then feel free to send a message through to us, and we'll be more than happy to cover this, in a video. We won't mention your name or whatever, but, we'll cover it in another video, or we'll help you out directly if needs be. As I said before, PCI DSS can be as complicated or as easy for you as you want to make it for yourself, but you have to have the understanding, and you have to really kind of make sure that you're dedicated towards achieving it. Okay, so that's requirement 12. If you like the video, please like, subscribe, press the little bell notification, leave a comment, leave a thumbs up. It's great for the algorithm. As I said in many videos, we've got loads of new followers. A lot of it is because of the PCI DSS set that we're doing at the moment. It's obviously quite a popular subject for you guys. So please feel free to feed back to us what you need, or how you're finding these videos, and we'll modify accordingly. But that's James Reese from RaceWire on requirement 12 of PCI DSS. Start at the end. We'll start back at requirement 1 probably for the next video in maybe next week or in a couple of days. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great weekend, and speak to you soon. Thank you.